Morning, folks. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Ambulances queuing outside hospitals, beds queued up inside. Will Theresa May's promise of long-term funding for the NHS put an end to these scenes? Jeremy Corbyn continues to be dogged by accusations of anti-Semitism. He's apologised, but what action is he going to take to eliminate it from the Labour Party? Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn will battle it out at noon in the last PM queues before Easter. We'll bring it all to you live and uninterrupted. And Boris Johnson gets ticked off by the Speaker.
It's inappropriate and frankly sexist to speak in those terms.
So all that's coming up in the next 90 minutes. With me for the duration, Energy Minister Claire Perry, Shadow Justice Minister Richard Burgon. He'll be with us till midday. He then's got to go back to the Commons for an urgent question. But first this morning, the chairman of the Parole Board, Nick Hardwick. He's resigned after the High Court overturned the board's decision to release the black cap rapist, John Worboys. Let's go straight to our correspondent, Angus Crawford. He's outside the High Court. Angus, fill us in on what's happened this morning.
Well, this is in some senses, when we talk about Nick Hardwick's resignation, if you like, a necessary sacrifice of a dysfunctional system. Everyone, from judges to politicians to those in the parole board, seem now to admit that the system hasn't been working. Well, what happened today? The judges unanimously decided that the original decision taken by the parole board back in December last year to release John Worboys on parole was irrational, that they had not considered his wider offending. They had only considered the charges that he had been convicted on and not of the multiple other counts laid at his door, something like 105 other potential victims. So that was one major issue that was decided, that the board should sit again, potentially this time headed by a retired or serving judge. The other really big issue, which is very significant, is that the judges decided there was simply too much secrecy involved in parole board hearings and what information was released, the so-called Rule 25, which meant that the victims of John Worboys were never told about why he was seen as being suitable for release. So those are the two major issues decided in the court today, but it appears that Professor Hardwick met with the Secretary of State yesterday and it was made quite clear that his position was now untenable. But as I say, both politicians, Nick Hardwick himself and the parole board all seem to agree that there is a major case now for reform of the system.
Angus, thank you very much for that. Angus outside the High Court there. Claire Perry, the government said it was going to pursue a judicial review and then decided not to in the light of this decision. That was clearly a mistake.
Well, which I know Richard's got to go, I'll let my colleagues talk about that in the House of Commons with the urgent question. But I have to say, the shocking thing that came through with this case was how much damage that man had done to so many women.
We know that. My question was, did the government not... The government left it to his victims to go for a judicial review, having said it would do it. Given how the judges have now ruled, the government made a mistake. That's clear.
I'm going to let my colleague answer those questions in the House of Commons later. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do.
But it's obvious it was a mistake, isn't it?
Well, he may have other points to make, but I know David will take this absolutely seriously. I think it's right that Nick Hardwick has taken responsibility for this.
Did the government help
the
victims? Did it give any aid to the victims?
Well, I think
if
you look at the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary's record in making the police services take issues of sexual violence and sexual crime seriously.
Did they give the victims any help? They left it to the victims to do. Did the government help in any way?
I don't know.
Are you happy that this is how the judges have ruled?
Well, I think victims and wider society will welcome this. But people should also note that the parole board hearing has to be run again. So the original decision was unlawful, so it has to be heard again.
Is it possible then that the parole board could still... I mean, the judges, as I understand it, it's just been breaking, they've asked the parole board to think again. No more than that, I think. They didn't quite like the first decision. It's still possible the parole board could come, when it meets again, thinks again, to the same decision.
That is possible. What is clear is that the victims have been let down throughout this process, right from the first reports of an attack to the police, right through to the way they weren't kept informed by the victim liaison unit. What also disappointed me as well, though, and I will say this, is that the Secretary of State, David Gauke, briefed the newspapers that he was going to be pursuing a judicial review.
Correct.
And now he seems to be paying the price for that.
Because he then changed his mind.
Yes, and I don't think he should have briefed the papers in the first place about that.
All right. We'll leave it there. It'll be a developing story as the day goes on. Now, Theresa May has told MPs that she wants to see a sustainable long-term plan for the NHS and to get away from, quote, annual top-ups, and that the government would come forward with a plan this year. July is what's been talked about, which is the 70th anniversary of the founding of the NHS. This is what she had to say to a House of Commons committee. It's called the Liaison Committee. She said this yesterday.
This year and in advance of next year's spending review, I do want to come forward with a long-term plan. I want that to be done in conjunction with leaders of the NHS, with clinicians and health experts, and the government will provide a multi-year funding settlement in support of the plan, consistent with our fiscal rules and balanced approach, but ensuring that the NHS can cope with the rising demand ahead of the spending review.
So is the government now going to go for a 10-year plan?
Well, the number hasn't been set, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because we already have the 5-year plan that we committed. We've spent 10 billion since 2010. But I think the implication from what she was saying, and clearly we've got to get out and consult and do it right, is that it will be for substantially longer than that, and I think that's really welcome.
Can you give us any idea of how much extra cash is going to be involved?
Well, every time the NHS has asked for additional funds, we've provided them. And we know that the issue is that demand goes up and up and up every year. It's not just a question of funding, it's a question of making sure that money is well spent. It's making sure we're supporting the brilliant NHS workers.
So you can't give us any idea?
No, I'm not going to sit here and front run the budget. But I think what is really clear is this idea of the multi-year top-ups and having to have those individual negotiations. That time has passed.
You have got a lot of ground to make up. Let me just show you these figures of the average rise in health spending under various governments. If we can get so there you have under Mr. Blair 6%, Gordon Brown over 5%, Mr. Major just under 5%, Mrs. Thatcher just under 3%, David Cameron, which includes the first part of Mrs. May too. It's the way these figures have been done, 1.4%. I mean, it's so much lower than in previous times.
Let me tell you,
so you have a lot of ground to make up.
Looking at those numbers, let me tell you what happened in my constituency under Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown, where we spent £68 million doing a new hospital under a PFI, which was something that Mr. Brown expanded dramatically. We built lots of new hospitals, we didn't staff them properly, and then we promptly cut the services for my local constituents because we couldn't afford to pay the unitary charge. So my question on that is, has that money been well spent? Have we got healthier? Are we delivering better care? Are we employing more skilled people in the workforce? Yes, we are. Are we delivering better care? So this idea that, because what Richard will say is we'll spend more than you. It's always easy to spend more. We'll spend
Richard
a pound
will say
more than
what
you.
he says will come to him in a
the
moment.
Is,
what I want, can you name any time in the past 70 years when spending on the NHS has gone up by less than 1.4%.
Can you name any time in the last 70 years?
You don't ask the questions. I ask the questions.
Well, let me ask you a question,
Can you tell us when NHS spending has risen by less than it has under your government?
Has NHS spending ever been enough? So have we ever heard a year in the last 70 years where the NHS has said we've got enough money for the demand?
That's an absurd argument. That's like an argument for saying let's not do anything because we'll never have enough.
It's an argument.
My point is on these figures, let's just have a look at them again up there because they're very important. They're IFS, they're for UK-wide, by the way, because this time series goes back to before health was devolved to Cardiff and to Edinburgh. Yep. There is no time in 70 years when spending on health has risen by less than 1.4%. That is the lowest in 70 years. So it seems to me obvious you have a lot of ground to make up.
So are you saying that the only way we define success in any form of public service is how much we spend?
No, but the government is saying it has to spend more.
But this is the debate. So but we're saying that within, as the Prime Minister said, within the constraints we have, which is we have to have a strong economy so we can continue. You'll remember at the end of Mr. Brown's period, we had the biggest deficit in peacetime history. So yes, we had 5.4% spending, Andrew, and that left us with the biggest hole in our public finances.
But you supported that 5.4% in opposition.
I wasn't an MP at that time.
The Conservative position was to support the Labour spending plan, so there was no difference.
You start with having a strong economy, because then you can invest in strong public services, and you know that our economy is stronger now than it's been at any point since 2008, and then you work out over the long term how you fund our precious services like the NHS.
My point is simply, I'll just make it again, then move on, is that given how low health spending increases have been in recent years, that in a sense you need to spend a lot more just to catch up. But I assume Labour will welcome this approach of extra funds and we're not quite sure, but perhaps a 10-year time horizon.
Well, Labour's shadow health spokesperson, Jonathan Ashworth, has been calling for this for some time. We welcome the fact that Theresa May says that later this year she wants to make an announcement about long-term funding, but now the pressure's on the government to actually deliver on that later this year and set out something which will take us forward to a position of the kind we had under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, where NHS levels of satisfaction were at record levels, waiting lists were down.
How do we justify that chart with the view that we have the best health service in the world?
Well, that's your view.
It's an independent view.
No, it's not. There's only one.
King's Commonwealth Fund.
Yes,
view.
it's the only think tank in the world that thinks the British NHS is the best. There's
really?
Not another single one thinks that. And that is because, as I've explained before, the Commonwealth Fund has an agenda in America. It's American, it's not a Commonwealth, although it's called that. An agenda to introduce an NHS-type system in America. So the NHS always, actually, in outcomes on the Commonwealth Fund, the NHS comes 12th.
And that's despite all of those years of increase.
Richard Burton, look at this. This is Mr. Blair's 6% in his years. This is what would have happened if you had won the election. Your manifesto, again, costed by the IFS, 2%. Under that, Mr. Blair 3 times more socialist than Mr. Corbyn.
I don't think there's a formula for socialism that can be
so
my point, easily applied.
So you weren't very... you were only 0.6% more than the government's actually done.
Well, what I would say, we were also going to halt the Conservatives' hospital closure programme. But
which hospital closure? There isn't a hospital closure programme, Richard.
Well, that was included.
There is
in
a
the
hospital
2%.
closure programme, and constituents across the country know that.
Yeah, well, there was one in my constituency, but I'm not. So, can you talk about the hospital closure programme that you've?
Well, I'll answer Andrew's questions rather than yours, if that's okay.
Because there isn't one.
Are you angling for my job? I mean, are things not going well in the energy department?
It's going swimmingly.
Want to be a BBC presenter? You're asking me questions. You're asking him questions. Answer that question. The fact is, you are not that ambitious on health.
First of all, I'm very proud, contrary to the arguments against the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown government, of what that Labour government did on the NHS. I think we've moved on now from PFI and other such projects. Things have moved on since then, and Labour will restore the NHS to the position it should be in the world, which is the envy of the world.
If the Conservatives take Britain over a time period to levels of health spending as a percentage of GDP as is in Germany, and it's a plan, and it's a multi-billion-year rise, what would then differentiate you from the Tories on health?
Well, we also believe in an NHS in public hands, rather than the drift towards an American-style healthcare system where they feel for your wallet before they feel for your pulse.
What are you talking? I'm sorry to ask the question. Where is that?
No, hold on, I'll ask it.
For example, trusts across the country, because of a VAT loophole, are trying to set up wholly owned subsidiary companies, which are in essence private companies owned by the NHS, and this is...
Our NHS is free at the point of use, isn't it?
And will always be so.
And that's the exact opposite of the American system.
Exactly, but we want to avoid a drift towards a marketisation and privatisation of our NHS.
But Tony Blair set up the introduction of third-party private providers, including the one in Devizes that does hips and knees, which is a private company.
All right.
So would you be
we'll have a lot more
to...
I just want to answer you a quick question. Boris Johnson says this is the Brexit dividend in action, is it?
Boris will make lots of claims for how that money gets spent. Forget the politics. We have to deliver a brilliant NHS service.
Forget the rhetoric. Just answer my question. Is it the Brexit dividend, as Mr Johnson says?
It is part of what you can deliver with a strong economy for your most precious
so it's not
public
the Brexit
service.
Dividend,
That's your words, not mine, Andrew.
Well, I'm just trying to get an answer. which is a bit of a struggle, as usual. Now, on Monday, Jewish groups wrote to Jeremy Corbyn to tell him that, quote, enough is enough, that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party had to be stamped out. The letter, accompanied by protests here in Westminster, were prompted by the emergence of a comment Mr Corbyn made on Facebook in 2012. And it's about this mural there. It's kind of, we think once or twice about whether we should show this, but we have, so that you know what we're talking about. He was opposing plans for it to be removed from this wall, as you can see there. He now accepts the mural was anti-Semitic, but he says that he hadn't looked at it closely enough. Richard Bergen, how closely do you have to look at that to realise it's anti-Semitic?
Well, I looked at it and I think it is clearly anti-Semitic. It was right that it was
So why
removed.
did Mr Corbyn not see that?
I think that if you're looking at something very quickly on the move, on a smartphone, for example, you could miss the detail. But it's clearly disturbing, clearly anti-Semitic, clearly unacceptable.
But if he was siding with the artist, saying he was in good company, actually, with other people whose work was taken down, don't you have to look at what you're defending? And the moment you look at that, it doesn't need a detailed study. The moment you look at it, it is clearly anti-Semitic. It's staged. I mean, the Nazis could have come up with that kind of mural.
I mean, Jeremy's made clear that he didn't look at it closely. He's made clear he thinks it's anti-Semitic as it is.
You
and
don't
should
really
be
have to
removed.
look at it closely. You just have to glance at it to see what it's all about, don't you?
It was clear to me when I saw it, my interpretation of it.
Why has anti-Semitism become endemic in the Labour Party?
Well, I think that there is a problem with anti-Semitism and tough action is needed. There's no place for anti-Semitic views in the Labour Party.
But there is.
In any party.
There is.
Or in society.
There are
as a
70
whole.
cases logged, a third under investigation, and according to John Mann, another 130 cases in the pipeline. So there is space for anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, clearly.
When I was growing up, one of the things which was one of my formative experiences in politics, when somebody came to our school who had been in Auschwitz and he showed us on his arm his serial number, I think we've also got to be clear that anti-Semitism didn't end with the end of the Second World War.
Well, we understand that. That's why we're talking about today's Labour Party.
Right that in Jeremy's letter, which I think is a very welcome move, in his letter to the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council, he talked about rooting out modern forms of anti-Semitism, and that's very important.
So why are only a third of these 70 cases currently being investigated?
Well, I think what is unacceptable is the fact that these cases have dragged on for so long.
But why?
And
because
so,
people think your heart's not in it. Not you personally, but your party's heart, Mr Corbyn's heart. I mean, Shami Chakrabarti at the Shadow Cabinet meeting yesterday, she was almost in tears at one stage. She in her disappointment that 2 years on her report hadn't yet been fully implemented.
And her report should be implemented,
2 years.
should have been implemented by the party structure. Now that Jeremy's frustrated, it hasn't been. It needs to be. And I think one of the challenges facing the new General Secretary of the Labour Party, who's starting this week, is to make one of the most significant parts of her tenure as General Secretary properly resourcing the unit to investigate these matters.
Why is Ken Livingstone still not been kicked out of the Labour Party?
Well, Ken Livingstone is suspended from the Labour Party.
Right, but he hasn't been kicked out.
He hasn't been.
Why?
And I understand, well, it's not for me to make the decisions, quite rightly. Elected politicians don't play a role in the decisions on who and who isn't
but if we are to
expelled.
take you seriously about this anti-Semitism embedded in parts of the Labour Party today, then we need to see you taking action to get rid of it. And Ken Livingstone has been a poster boy for this, and he's only been suspended. He's not been kicked out of the party.
He has no membership rights. He is suspended. He has no membership rights within the Labour Party. Let me be clear. I don't obviously agree with what Ken Livingstone said. He shouldn't have said what he said. It's unacceptable. But it's not for me to decide the outcome of that process.
But we're just wondering why it takes so long and why so many cases have yet to be investigated. I mean, Terence Flanagan, a member activist of Hampstead and Kilburn constituency Labour Party, we've seen emails. She describes Israel as a cesspit nation. He says that anti-Semitism, the allegations of anti-Semitism in Mr Corbyn's Labour Party is simply to try to destroy Corbynite Labour and is, quote, being orchestrated by Mossad, by the Israeli Secret Service. Now, he was suspended for a period and then readmitted Why?
Well, I can't comment on individual cases, and as you'd expect, I'm not aware of that individual case in any event. But what I would say is that they are appalling comments, and it's totally false.
But he's still a member of your party.
It's totally false to suggest that anti-Semitism isn't an issue. If it weren't an issue, people wouldn't have been expelled from the Labour Party as a result of it.
The
but we need to improve our
The Labour
processes.
Party press office told us that his remarks were not of a sufficient severity. They didn't reach the threshold to warrant him losing his membership. It must be a pretty high threshold.
Well, I think those are appalling remarks, and those views shouldn't have any place in the Labour Party. But it's not for me.
But they're in the Labour Party.
It's not for me to comment without seeing the whole case on the judgment that others.
Well, what about the mayor
It's not for
of,
elected. It's not for elected politicians to.
What about
carry out
the
these
former
processes.
mayor of Blackburn then, Salim Mullah? He said Zionist Jews were, quote, a disgrace to humanity. And he also said that Israel was behind the school shootings in the United States, and that Zionism was orchestrating ISIS.
I think people have got to understand.
This is your party.
Well, it's a small minority in our party, and I'm not saying that to make an excuse because it's completely unacceptable.
He was
It should have no
reinstated too.
place.
He was
Those views
reinstated.
should have no place in our
that's still
party.
But he's in your party. He's claiming that Israel. This is the kind of thing the Nazis did in the 30s. They accused the Jews of all sorts of things. And here is a member of your party who was suspended, then reinstated, blaming the Jews for the school shootings in the United States. I mean, how high is the threshold before you get kicked out for anti-Semitism now?
Well, I've met with the representatives of the Jewish Leadership Council. I've met with representatives of the boards of deputies, and I listened very carefully on Monday night to what my colleagues were saying in the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting. It's important that action's taken. I think it's important that in his letter, Jeremy not only said that he is and will remain a militant opponent of anti-Semitism, but also set out that we need to have a properly funded and resourced unit which deals with these cases much more swiftly because the delays have been completely unacceptable.
Why can we take him seriously when we now know he's been a member of 5 virulently anti-Semitic Facebook groups? 5!
Because he's quite careless, isn't he, with what he
Well,
responds to?
Jeremy's answered on that one. Some of these
5.
some of and other Facebook groups are ones in which anti-Semitic comments were made that he wasn't aware of.
But you didn't have to go deep analysis to find out how anti-Semitic they were. You just had to glance at them again to see. I mean, I've looked at them to see some of the comments. You didn't have to go in for textual study to see them.
I don't think that people see every comment that's made on
No,
their
I'm not
Facebook
saying that.
posts.
But these were rampant on these Facebook sites. I mean, didn't you also yourself? You told a Labour Party meeting, did you not, in 2016, that Zionism is the enemy of peace?
Well, that was an allegation made by the Daily Express. I asked them at which meeting I was meant to have said that.
I think it was reported in the Daily Mail.
The Daily Mail.
But
They
did you
couldn't
say
respond
that?
to me. I didn't say that, and they couldn't tell me when they believed I had said that. It's not my view.
So
I believe
you didn't say. It's important because you may well be correcting the record here, which is important. You didn't say that.
No, and it's not my view. I believe that on occasions the government of Israel, like the governments of other countries, has been an enemy of peace. But we've got to see that's a separate subject.
Oh, of course, and I understand the difference. Joan Ryan, though, Labour MP, she's the chair of Friends of Israel, she wrote to you asking you to clarify the comments, but when you replied to her, you didn't deny that you had made them.
Well, I didn't make those comments. I asked when I was meant to have made those comments. No one could tell me. And it's not my view. So if it's not my view, I wouldn't have made those comments.
Okay, so why didn't you just say, I didn't say
know
it?
that.
Because I've got your reply here. You didn't deny that you'd said it.
Well, I would not have said that because it's not my view.
Okay.
So you didn't say it?
Well, you didn't say it. You've said that.
I-
She's still practicing asking
Well,
questions.
can I, Andrew?
Very briefly, because we need to move on.
I just find it astonishing that in 2018 we have got a protest in Parliament Square of people who are not normally radicalised or politicised saying that Her Majesty's official opposition and people like Richard and the leader he supports are fervently anti-Semitic.
I mean, I think you'll agree I've asked some quite tough questions
yes.
of Richard Bergen, so we're going to move on.
It's just it's disgusting.
The government's announced
Disgraceful.
proposals to charge more for drink cans and bottles in an attempt to boost recycling. They've yet to decide how much that levy will be, but shoppers would get any deposit back when they return their items. I used to do that as a kid, actually. There's nothing new. Currently, almost 3 billion plastic bottles every year are thrown away after one use. Well, we know a bit about recycling here on The Daily Politics, the stories, the presenters, the jokes, the questions, often repeated by our guests, rarely answered by them, and to our profound regret, even the guest of the day. Oh, yes. Nothing lasts longer than one of these beauties. It's a Daily Politics mug. And I started using this one. Richard had a poster of Tony Blair on as well. Claire was still talking about the big society. Remember that? Yeah, no, I don't either. How things change. So, to win a mug that you will see through even to the end of Vladimir Putin's 15th fair and free election as Russian president, you just need to tell us when this happened.
So there are many things that I set myself to do that I've done, and this is a good time, I think, to change the leadership.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do. Stop in the name of love before you break my heart.
Her Majesty's government has been constantly in touch with the Commonwealth countries about this threatened illegal act by the Rhodesia government.
She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, and she don't care. You lost that love and feeling. Oh, that love and feeling. You've lost that love and feeling. Now it's gone, gone, gone. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
So there you are. To be in with a chance of winning a Daily Politics mug, you need to send your answer to our special quiz email address. That's dpquiz@bbc.co.uk. Entries must arrive by 12:30 today. You can see the full terms and conditions for guests here on our website. That's bbc.co.uk/Daily Politics. Now, it's coming up to midday here. There is Big Ben, still shielded in scaffolding for this major makeover. Prime Minister's Questions is a few minutes away. Laura Kuenssberg is already with us. So much going on. In general, this will take place as a backdrop. In relative terms, Mrs May's had quite a good couple of weeks. Mr Corbyn's had quite a bad couple of weeks. That juxtaposition hasn't happened for quite some time.
It hasn't, and this is the last Prime Minister's Questions before this recess, and that's really what's been going around my mind this morning. Politics often sees role reversals. In the last month or so, we have seen role reversals, really, between the two main leaders. We started off this session with Theresa May having a very difficult beginning to the year. Huge Tory divisions over Brexit, a feeling that instability was not just around because she doesn't have a majority, but instability and things being really shaky was almost sort of the watchword, really, around the Conservative Party. Meanwhile, Jeremy Corbyn looked very, very safe. The truce in the Labour Party, the public truce in the Labour Party, seemed to be absolutely holding. But in the last couple of weeks, there has been a real switcheroo, and people go off for their Easter holidays. Of course, MPs go off to work very hard every day in their constituencies before they start complaining about me suggesting they'll have long holidays. Yes, exactly. You know, in a different way, Tory MPs will be going back to their constituencies thinking, oh, actually, still got a few problems, but this is much better than a few months ago. And Labour MPs talking again, I have to say, about whether or not the different parts of the Labour Party can stay being stitched together. Yes,
and that has come up as an issue. But we live in such a febrile political atmosphere these days that we don't know how any of either Mrs May being up, Mr Corbyn being down for now, by the time we come back again, it could have completely reversed itself. That's right,
and there's no sense of permanence about any of those perceptions. But it is notable that in the last 2-3 weeks, things have really
That's
flipped.
detectable. We just don't know for how.
And I think the events in Russia, because of course, you know, political events in Westminster are not just in the SW1 vacuum. I think the diplomatic situation and those unfolding events have given a new sense of purpose and strength her supporters would say around Theresa May and the way the rest of the EU and the rest of the world has
She surprised
reacted
us,
to her.
I think, by the number, or by the solidarity of our allies.
Yes, and when we went off to Brussels for the summit last week, Number 10 were not optimistic that very many other people were going to sign off. One of the other European leaders said to me before the meeting in the evening, I think we will give her stronger language, but whether we go further than that, I do not know. And for once, in the course of that couple of hours over dinner, it really changed. On the flip side, for Jeremy Corbyn, the difference of view in the Labour Party over attitude to Russia, how to deal with this situation, has sort of cracked open that truce, as I was mentioning it. And we've seen quite extraordinary
And then the
scenes.
anti-Semitism comes on top of it as well.
Exactly.
My understanding, I don't know whether you were told this, is that with some of our key allies, Mrs May agreed to share the raw intelligence.
Yes, and she...
The actual raw intelligence.
Yes, and she hinted at that herself the next morning as she was arriving at the summit. She said she had told, they had discussed the intelligence, she had shared it, and I think clearly there is I think it's pretty clear she'd gone further than other prime ministers had in different suggestions because of different situations. Because, of course, around the table in the EU, you have some people who are members of the Five Eyes intelligence agreement, where basically we share everything with our very closest allies. But with 27 other countries, we've got very different intelligence relationships with some of them. But what one senior minister was saying to me this morning, they believe what has paid dividends is Theresa May making it clear in her speech in Munich that security cooperation from the UK was unconditional.
And
Whatever
wasn't part of a
Brexit,
bargaining card in the
exactly.
negotiations.
Because from time to time, it has been seen that way. You know, there has been mutterings here and there, including from some people in government, saying, well, of course, you know, we know the people at the eastern edges of the EU would be pretty happy if we were able to, you know, send some more NATO forces there, where, you know, some people have believed that it could be the realpolitik, it could be a bargaining chip. But there is a belief in government that her commitment in the Munich speech has changed the dynamic in these negotiations.
And that was the fruit of it.
And that was the fruit of it, which also some people in Brussels, as well as some people in Westminster, have said does give a more positive dynamic at the beginning of the next phase of the Brexit negotiations. Now, of course, look, in a couple of weeks, it could all feel like it's completely chaotic and unstable again. But
Indeed.
for now, it's interesting how the international picture
It has changed. There's no
has changed.
I mean, we were all
the
amazed
dynamic.
that Mr Trump kicked out 16.
Yeah. And the
closed,
length of the list
closed
to the
Seattle.
number of countries
Seattle,
involved.
clearly a major listening post for Russian intelligence on high tech. So that was a significant thing to do. None of this, though, Laura, solves the problem. What does Mr Corbyn go on today?
Well, interesting. So I'm curious as to whether he will raise the issue of NHS funding.
Well, let's go and see, because we can go over and join Prime. We say goodbye to Richard Bergen. We know you've got to go to the comments. Thank you, Richard. Straight to the Prime Minister and PMPs.
And everyone who works here on the parliamentary estate a very happy Easter. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mike Wood. Under Conservative leadership since last May, Dudley Council has protected social care and other core services. Will the Prime Minister reject the calls from the opposition to scrap the council tax referendum law, which prevents excessive council tax rises?
First of all, I'm very happy to agree with my honourable friend, and he does raise an important point. And he also makes the point about the success of Dudley Council under Conservative-led, because people living in Conservative-led Dudley Council area pay among the lowest council tax in the West Midlands. And since taking control from Labour, the council has reversed Labour's street cleaning cuts, scrapped their plans to charge for green waste collection, and maintained the weekly bin collection. So it's very clear, if you want to pay less and get good services, vote Conservative on the 3rd of May.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I too join the Prime Minister in wishing yourself and all members of the House, and indeed our entire community, a very happy Easter. This week is Autism Awareness Week, and I welcome the work of the National Autistic Society and others. Mr Speaker, I hope the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the families of Connor Sparrowhawk and Teresa Colvin for their dignity in campaigning for answers about the deaths of their loved ones at the hands of Southern Health. Last week, the Health Service Ombudsman said too many patients suffered failings in mental health care involving violations of the most basic human rights of patients. How confident is the Prime Minister that deaths like Connor's and Teresa's could not happen today?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, he does raise a very important point. I think that, first of all, there have been significant steps taken in raising awareness of autism and ensuring that there is support available for those who are on the autistic spectrum. But the very sad deaths we saw of Teresa Colvin and Connor Sparrowhawk do raise very real questions. I join him in paying tribute to the families for the way in which that they have campaigned on this particular issue. And obviously these incidents took place some time ago, and lessons have been learned by the health and social care system as a result of the failings of Southern Health NHS Foundation Trust. The government is supporting NHS providers to be open, to learn from mistakes so that they reduce the risks to future patients and prevent tragedies from happening. But a comprehensive CQC inspection into Southern Health is expected later this year.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The Ombudsman, Rob Behrens, also said, and I quote, there aren't enough skilled and qualified staff. There is a problem in recruiting them, and there is an overuse of agency staff. So, Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister explain why there are 5,000 fewer mental health nurses than there were in 2010?
I say to the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, as he knows, we have already committed to improving mental health services on the ground. We are putting extra money into mental health services. I'm pleased to say that around 1,400 more people are accessing mental health services every day compared to when we came into power. And of course, it is this government that has ensured that we've given parity of esteem to the treatment of mental health in the National Health Service and are increasing the training and recruitment of people to provide those mental health services. This is about the NHS, it's also about services in our communities. And it's also about ensuring that we can intervene at an early stage for those young people who develop mental health problems, which is why I'm pleased to say I was pleased to launch the initiative for there to be training in schools so there's a member of staff who's able to identify mental health problems and able to ensure that young people get the support they need.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, in 2012 the Health and Social Care Act did indeed embed parity of esteem into law, thanks to a Labour amendment introduced in the House of Lords. But sadly, the money never followed. The charity Rethink Mental Illness said recently our overstretched services are failing. ITV's Project 84 campaign highlights the horrifying figure that male suicide is the biggest killer of men under 45, 84 taking their lives every week. Earlier this month, the Health Secretary said the Prime Minister and I have made mental health services a personal priority. Now, Mr. Speaker, I fully acknowledge and accept the Prime Minister's very genuine concern about mental health, but mental health trusts have got fewer resources. So why does the analysis by the Royal College of Psychiatrists show mental health trusts have 105 million less than they had 6 years ago?
To the right honourable gentleman, as I've just said, of course, dealing with mental health is not just a question of what is happening inside the health service. There are wider areas of responsibility for dealing with mental health. What have we done on mental health? Yes, the parity of esteem is there. As I said, 1,400 more people are accessing mental health services every day compared to when we came into power. Spending on mental health has increased to a record £11.6 billion, with a further £1 billion by 2021. We are ensuring that we're putting more money in. We have responded to the report of the Stevenson Farmer Review into mental health in the workplace. It's all very well Labour members chuntering about this, but dealing with mental health means addressing it in a variety of ways. We are taking more steps to address the issues of mental health than the Labour government ever took when they were in power.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, mental health spending fell by £600 million between 2010 and 2015. And far too often, a mental health crisis has to be dealt with either by police, friends or neighbours or people in the community, and too many of our fellow citizens suffer alone because there are insufficient staff to help them at a moment of crisis. It is quite clear that the mental health budget is insufficient. So can the Prime Minister explain, and she mentioned young people in this, why only 6% of the overall mental health budget is spent on children and young people when they make up 20% of our population?
Say to the right honourable gentleman, as I've just repeated, we are in fact increasing the services that are available to children and young people. But this isn't just about what happens in NHS trusts. It's important we look at this in the round. That is why it's important that we're putting ensuring that there is that training in schools to help young people. We've committed to ensuring 70,000 more children and young people each year will have access to high-quality NHS mental health care by 2020-21. We've backed these proposals by additional funding, the work that we're doing in schools and how they deal with mental health for children and young people. But we're also taking action in other areas. When I was Home Secretary, one of the issues I saw was the fact that the police found it very difficult to deal with people in mental health crisis because they didn't have the training to do that, and actually taking them into a cell to be there overnight, including young people, was not helping those young people. We have changed that. We've seen a dramatic reduction in the number, and we have made clear that young people will not and will never be taken to a police cell as a place of safety.
Mr. Speaker, I fully acknowledge the work the police do in helping people in a mental health crisis. My point is there should be more mental health professionals to help people in a crisis. Half of all enduring mental health conditions actually materialise before the age of 14. Spending on child and adolescent mental health should be a priority. Instead, sadly, the number of child and adolescent psychiatrists has fallen by 6.3%. There has to be a priority in fully staffing our children's and young persons' mental health.
That was a statement, not a question.
I'm not aware there was a question at the end of that, Mr. Speaker, but I will repeat the point. No, the issue of young people's mental health is a very serious issue. That is why the right honourable gentleman is focusing on one aspect of this. That is why we are ensuring that we do start to address this at an earlier stage. He's right about the a high proportion of mental health problems that start before somebody is age 14. It's exactly why we are doing more in our schools, why we're working to ensure that we do have that training for teachers. But there's a wider issue here that I'm sure that everybody in this House will recognise. Because when I go and talk to young people who have developed mental health problems, when I hear from them about the problems that they're facing, sadly, one of the issues that puts increasing pressure on the mental health of young people today is the use of social media and the bullying and harassment that they get on that social media. And I hope that he will join with me in saying that we need both to help our young people have greater resilience in dealing with that social media bullying, but we also need to ensure that we see social media not being used in a way that leads to mental health problems that could well be with those young people for the rest of their life.
Jeremy Corbyn! I hope, in the light of what the Prime Minister just said, she will support our digital bill, which will ensure that there are proper protections for people. Mr. Speaker, a young woman wrote to me this week who's been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and is regarded as a high suicide risk. She was told to wait 3 months for an appointment. That was cancelled and she had to wait a further 3 months. It is very hard to explain to someone in that situation why they have to wait all those months for an appointment while they're in a very desperate situation. Mr. Speaker, mental health affects us all, and it's welcome that there is now much less stigma surrounding mental health. However, our NHS is in crisis. The crisis is particularly acute in mental health services. Despite legislating for parity of esteem, the government has failed to fund it. We have fewer resources for mental health trusts, fewer mental health nurses, fewer child and adolescent psychiatrists. So will the Prime Minister commit to ring-fencing NHS mental health budgets to support those going through a mental health crisis at a time they most need our help and our support?
And I say to the right honourable gentleman that the National Health Service is receiving extra funding from this government, extra funding for mental health and extra funding for other services. Since November, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has announced an extra £10 billion which is going into our NHS over the next few years. Why are we able to do that? We're able to do that because we take a balanced approach to our economy. That means keeping our debts down. It means ensuring that we are investing in our public services like the NHS and mental health services, and actually keeping taxes down for ordinary working people. Labour's approach would mean increased debt, it would mean less money for mental health services and higher taxes for working people, and ordinary working people would pay the price of Labour.
Mr. Peter Heaton-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend for getting on with Brexit? Nearly 60% of voters in North Devon voted to leave. Rather than dismissing them as old people yearning for a world of white faces, shouldn't we respect their decision, get on and deliver it?
To my honourable friend that I absolutely agree with him. We need to get on and delivering Brexit, recognising the vote that was taken. And it's a pity that what we've seen from the party opposite is a track record of trying to frustrate Brexit rather than trying to make it work. Their MEPs voted against us moving on the negotiations via the European Parliament. They voted against the bill that will give us a smooth withdrawal from the EU. And the opposition oppose us spending money to prepare for our exit. It's the Conservatives in government that are getting on and delivering for the voters of North Devon.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The public must have trust in our political process. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that transparency in political campaign spending and the integrity of electoral laws across the UK must be upheld? And will the Prime Minister join with me in saying that all allegations of improper spending during the EU referendum must be fully investigated?
To the right honourable gentleman, we have laws about election spending that parties are required to abide by those laws. I understand that any allegations that have come forward in respect of spending by during the referendum have already been investigated by the Electoral Commission, but of course it's right that allegations are investigated by the Electoral Commission.
And Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, we know that before the EU referendum, the DUP received £425,000 from the Conservative-run Constitutional Research Council, chaired by Richard Cook, former Vice Chair of the Scottish Tories. We know some of the money was given to Aggregate IQ, a reported franchise of Cambridge Analytica. We know that Chris Wylie is absolutely convinced of a common purpose between Vote Leave, Believe, Veterans for Britain and the DUP. The shady business of data mining and undermining electoral law goes right to the heart of the Prime Minister's party. Will the Prime Minister issue the full details of the transactions between the DUP and the Scottish Tory-linked CRC?
He refers to the issue of Vote Leave. As I have just said, I understand this is a matter that has already been investigated twice by the Electoral Commission, and he raises questions about inquiries. If there are allegations of criminal activity, that should be taken to the police. The regulator of election spending is the Electoral Commission, so if there's an allegation of breaches of campaign spending or campaign funding rules, then that should be taken by the Electoral Commission. My understanding is the Electoral Commission does indeed investigate these and will continue to do so when allegations are brought to its attention.
Trudy Harrison.
Outstanding staff dedication, the passion of my community and ambitious leadership have secured huge government investment and nationally celebrated excellence. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that when the department is fully staffed, 24/7 consultant-led maternity shall be secured?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I know this is an issue on which she has campaigned and campaigned strong and hard in the interests of her constituents. And the NHS in North Cumbria is working on plans for considerable investment, as she says, in local health services, including the completion of the new build of the West Cumberland Hospital and the creation of an academic campus. And it is committed to doing all it can to maintain those consultant-led maternity services at West Cumberland Hospital. Patient safety is the key, that's the priority, but the NHS is doing all it can to ensure there is a safe and sustainable service can be provided to my honourable friends, constituents and others.
Thomas Simmons. Mr. Speaker, there are some beautiful stately homes in this country, but our heritage is equally about the history of working people. Shortly, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Industrial Heritage, which I chair, will publish its report into how best we utilise that great industrial past for the jobs of the future. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how we can best implement its recommendations?
But can I say to the honourable gentleman, I'd like to look at the report that his group is providing first, and I think what he is saying is something that would potentially fit into the modern industrial strategy that this government has already launched, because what we want to do is build on the strengths of our economy, but ensure that our people here in the UK are skilled for the jobs of the future. I'm happy to look at the report and ensure that either he can meet me or the BEIS Secretary to look at its results.
Mr. David Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, investigative reporter Patrick Christys has uncovered questions of serious data breaches by Labour headquarters. The Information Commissioner has been notified. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, join with me asking the Information Commissioner to do a thorough investigation?
Well, obviously, as I've said before in this House, it's important that people are able to have confidence in how their personal data is being used, and it's important that the Information Commissioner is able to investigate cases where they are drawn to the attention. And in the Data Protection Bill, we will strengthen the law in this area. We're going to give the Information Commissioner's Office tougher provisions to ensure that organisations comply with those investigations. And at the heart of our digital charter that we've set out here is that concept, that principle that personal data should be respected and used appropriately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the National Audit Office, local councils have had their funding cut by a massive 49.1% since 2010. Children's services up and down the country are on their knees. A Tory council has gone bust, and the gap now nationally is £5.8 billion. When is the Prime Minister going to wake up to this crisis made in Downing Street?
He talks about funding for local councils. Of course, we are seeing and have seen in the announcements that have been made by my right honourable friend, the Housing Secretary, more money going into local councils over the next couple of years. But can I say to the honourable gentleman that if he worries about what is happening at local council level, he ought to look at the figures that have come out today, which show very clearly that if you're living in a council, in an area where the council is run by the Labour Party, you pay £100 more than under the Conservatives.
Chris Phil!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister join me in welcoming recent figures showing that last year the number of first-time buyers buying a home hit a 10-year record high at 359,000? Does she agree that last year's stamp duty cut and the extension of Help to Buy played an important part in doing that? And does she agree that promoting home ownership, as Margaret Thatcher did, will remain a central part of the government's policy?
I'm very
happy to confirm to my honourable friend that promoting home ownership does remain a central part of this government's policy. We are also introducing a number of measures which will help those people who are renting their properties as well. But I'm pleased, as he said, that we've seen the number of first-time buyers reaching its highest level for, I think he said 10 years, I think it's 11 years that they're reaching its highest levels. And of course, it's been important that not only do we provide funding for Help to Buy, but also that cut in stamp duty. And I have to say, the Labour Party sometimes talk about homes, but actually, which party was it that voted against that cut in stamp duty? The Labour Party.
Ruth George!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I asked my constituents what they would like me to ask, and they overwhelmingly said, how can the Prime Minister justify that from next week, families in poverty earning just £145 a week are expected to find £10 per week for each of their children to eat a nutritious school dinner, whilst members of this House earning 10 times...
Order. I don't care how long it takes. I've got all the time in the world. The question will be heard and the answer will be heard. And that applies to every single question and answer in this chamber, no matter how long it takes. Ruth George.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To conclude my question, I was asking about families earning just £145 a week not receiving school dinners for their children, whilst members of this House earning 10 times their sum, subject to subsidised catering from the taxpayer.
Well, can I say to the honourable lady that I hope she was not implying in her question that anybody who is currently in receipt of a free school meal will have that taken away from them, because they will not. They will not. And she talks about changes that are happening next week. Yes, we will actually see pensioners getting a boost to their pension next week. Families, 31 million income taxpayers will get an income tax cut, and 2 million people living on the national living wage will get a pay rise. That's Conservatives delivering for everyone.
Lucy Allen!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the most exciting day that I have ever got to my feet in this House. Mr. Speaker, that is because today this government has made an announcement which will improve the lives of every single one of my constituents in Telford. Today, Mr. Speaker, the government has announced £312 million investment in new hospital services in our area. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, join me in welcoming this fantastic news and the benefits it will bring to Telford. And will she also very kindly wish everyone in Telford a very happy Easter?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to wish everyone in Telford and indeed around the country a very happy Easter. And I'm very pleased to welcome, as my honourable friend has done, the considerable investment in the hospital in her serving her constituents, which has been announced by the NHS. This is another example of the way that all we ever hear from the Labour Party is about the NHS being done down in funding terms. What we see on the ground is more money going to the NHS, improving services and serving constituents.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Sunday, thousands of Iraqi Christians and Yazidis walked through the Nineveh Plain in northern Iraq celebrating Palm Sunday. They have not done that for 6 years. This is welcome, as Iraqi Christians are one of the most persecuted religious groups in the world. All Christians celebrate Christ's resurrection this weekend. Will the Prime Minister pledge her support to help persecuted Christians around the world?
Say to the honourable gentleman that Easter is, of course, the most important time in the Christian calendar. It is a time of new life and hope, and that message of Christ's resurrection and the cross and the resurrection, I think, do help to support Christians around the world. But he's absolutely right about the very real persecution that too many Christians face around the world. I was pleased to meet recently Father Daniel from Nineveh and Idlib, talking about the very real prosecution that his congregations were suffering. And he presented me with a Bible that had been burned and rescued when a church had been set on fire, which is now in number 10 Downing Street. But we stand with those persecuted Christians, and we will be looking to see what more the government can do to support them.
Jill Donnellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Adverse childhood experiences include domestic abuse, sexual abuse, parental separation, and also living with an alcoholic, to name but a few. According to Public Health England, adults who have experienced 4 or more of these in their childhood are severely at risk of mental health problems, suicide, incarceration, and violent tendencies. Will the Prime Minister commission a national review to not only enable social mobility, but help save thousands of lives?
Can I say to my honourable friend, she raises a very important point, and this is why, when we look at the issue of mental health problems and mental health difficulties for young people, we need to look widely at the ways in which those problems can be caused and the origins of those problems. And she's right that the sort of abuse that she has referred to can have a very terrible effect on the mental health of young people. On her specific point, our Green Paper on transforming children's mental health services does propose the establishment of new mental health support teams who will be there, managed by schools, colleges and the NHS. But one of the issues they will particularly look at is supporting young people who've experienced trauma. And she's identified a number of those cases where those young people may experience that trauma. I think it is important. This is about the young people's futures, and it's necessary to get...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. LGBT rights in Northern Ireland are in limbo. The Assembly has already voted for equal marriage and public support for it is overwhelming. Will the Prime Minister stop hiding behind the DUP, and will she take this opportunity to put on record her support for the bill being brought forward by my honourable friend, the member for St Helens North?
I hope the honourable gentleman will recognise the record that this government has in relation to LGBT rights, because this is an issue that we have taken up. It is an issue that we have championed. I think the honourable gentleman will find that actually it is previous legislation, I think legislation actually under the last Labour government, that ensured that this was a devolved matter that will be dealt with, and we hope that there will be a Northern Ireland executive in place soon that will be able to address these issues.
Kinley. Mr. Speaker, the people of Ramsgate face an uncertain future regarding their dental care. NHS England South East had entered into a 5-year contract with Kent Community NHS Foundation Trust to run Church Hill Dental Practice, serving 8,000 patients. That contract comes to an end this Saturday, the practice will close and there is no replacement in place. Would my right honourable friend encourage the appropriate commissioners to work with me to find an urgent solution?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I'm sure that his working with those who are looking for the solution will be important and will be welcomed. I understand that when that Church Hill dental practice closes, NHS England will be working with other dental practices in the area to ensure that services are available and that they can increase their capacity. There's a wider piece of work being undertaken about dental services in East Kent, the needs and the provision of those services, and I'm sure, as I say, my honourable friend's contribution to that will be welcomed.
Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary was the figurehead for the Vote Leave campaign and the Environment Secretary was co-convener. Their campaign director, Dominic Cummins, is quoted in the Aggregate IQ website as saying, "The Vote Leave campaign owes a great deal of its success to the work of Aggregate IQ. We couldn't have done it without them." How does she feel about her minister's been caught red-handed using immoral data mining techniques?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, he's making certain claims in that question which I don't recognise. And can I simply say this: if there are those who are trying to suggest that the government should be rejecting the result of the referendum as a result of these sorts of claims, I say to them very clearly, the referendum...
Order! Calm yourself, Mr. Brown. I know you were obviously a very popular figure when you rose to ask your question, but you must listen to the answer. My dear chap, patience. The Prime Minister.
As I was saying, the referendum was held, the vote was taken, the people gave their view, and we will be delivering on it.
Mr. Edward Arger.
Thank you, sir. My right honourable friend will be aware of the fantastic Wellbank Sixth Form Defence College in Woodhouse in my constituency, which equips young people planning a career in our armed forces with the skills they need to help defend this country in the 21st century. Can the Prime Minister confirm that we will continue to invest in strong defences for our country so these young people can play their full part in the future in the best armed forces in the world.
Well, can I first of all join my honourable friend in recognising the work that is done by the Welbeck Sixth Form Defence College in his constituency and the skills it gives to young people who wish to enter the armed forces. But he does raise a more important point about funding in relation to our armed forces, and I can announce today that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and I have agreed that the Ministry of Defence will have access to £600 million this coming financial year for the MOD's Dreadnought submarine programme. Today's announcement will ensure that the work to rebuild the UK's new world-class nuclear submarines remains on schedule, and it's another sign of the deep commitment this government has to keeping our country safe. And along with the 200 million carry forward agreed at the supplementary estimates, this means the MOD will benefit from an extra 800 million in the next financial year, and we continue to exceed the NATO 2% target and remain the second biggest defence spender in NATO.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Cambridge Analytica revelations suggest that there is something rotten in the state.
Order. This is very unseemly. No, I'm sorry, it's very unseemly. The Honourable Mr. Pound, your expertise in gesticulation is well known to all members of the House, but is not required to be on display at this time. Caroline Lucas will be heard. Caroline Lucas, we're grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Cambridge Analytica revelations suggest that there is something rotten in the state of our democracy. The current electoral law is woefully inadequate at dealing with the combination of big money and big data. So will the Prime Minister commit to urgent cross-party talks to kickstart a process to ensure that we have a regulatory and legal framework that is up to the challenge of dealing with the digital age?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady, as I've said previously, clearly the allegations relating to Cambridge Analytica are concerning, because people should be able to have confidence about how their personal data is being used. I think it's right that what we're seeing is the Information Commissioner investigating this matter. I expect Facebook, Cambridge Analytica and any others involved to cooperate fully with the Information Commissioner's Office in that investigation that is taking place. And our Data Protection Bill, as I said earlier, will strengthen the powers of the Information Commissioner, but it will also strengthen legislation around data protection, as will the other steps the government has taken through, for example, our Digital Charter. This is a government that is committing to making sure that this is a safe place to be online.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister confirm her reported opinion that we're highly unlikely to introduce a new hard border between Britain and Europe by December 2020? And presumably it could take years to train thousands of customs officers to build new lorry parks and other infrastructure at Dover, Holyhead and elsewhere if we tried to. So will she confirm her strongly preferred policy option of frictionless trade in future between the EU and the United Kingdom, an open border in Ireland in conformity with the Good Friday Agreement, and seek a customs arrangement which I personally hope will resemble the existing customs union very closely indeed?
I say to my right honourable and learned friend, we are indeed committed. We've given that commitment. We gave it in the December joint report. We've given it in the negotiating stage that was completed last week to ensure that there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Also to ensure that businesses in Northern Ireland can continue to trade freely with the rest of the United Kingdom and vice versa. We are working to ensure that we have tariff-free and trade that is as frictionless as possible. As I'm sure my right honourable and learned friend will know, actually, trade between the UK and the EU isn't completely frictionless today, but we will ensure that trade is as frictionless as possible in the future. We've put forward proposals. We've started discussing those in detail with the European Commission, and I assure my right honourable friend that the Home Secretary and others are taking the steps necessary to ensure that we have the arrangements in place for when we come to the end of that implementation period.
Lisa Nandy.
It's been 4 weeks since the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse published a damning report about the treatment of British children sent overseas by their government. They were physically, sexually and emotionally abused, separated from siblings and wrongly told that their families were dead. Successive governments suppressed information, ignored warnings and continued to send children to harm for decades. The report is unequivocal that compensation is owed and that this is now urgent. Many have died and others are dying. But in the last 4 weeks, the government has failed to issue a response, to set out any timetable for a response and to even agree which department is responsible for formulating a response. She commissioned this report. Will she now get a grip on her government, stand by its verdict and ensure that no more have to die waiting for justice?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that I did indeed commission the work that is being done in looking at the treatment of children and the abuse of children in the past. I think that was important, and I said when I put that in place that I thought that many people would be shocked by some of the results that they saw coming out of that, including, obviously, as she has said, this issue in relation to former child migrants. I can confirm to her that it is the Department of Health and Social Care that has responsibility for policy for former child migrants. As she will know, we've funded the Child Migrants Trust since 1990 so that they can expand their work in seeking resolution for former child migrants and their families. They've received over £7 million of funding, and we've provided £1 million for travel in the 1990s to help former child migrants reunite with their families. And there was, of course, at the time of the government's formal national apology to former child migrants in 2010, an £8 million family restoration fund was established. But she asked, there is clear responsibility. It is with the Department of Health and Social Care.
Caroline Spelman.
Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister join me in congratulating the young British artist Hannah Rose Thomas and the charity Open Doors for putting on the current exhibition in our upper waiting hall to draw attention to the plight of Yazidi women, 3,000 of whom are still in captivity in some form of slavery, something that my right honourable friend has fought so hard to combat?
Well, can I say to my right honourable friend that I'm very happy to welcome this awareness-raising exhibition that is taking place, and to commend Hannah Rose Thomas and others involved in bringing to the attention of the House and those visiting the House the plight of the Yazidi women. This is something which I know caused horror and consternation from people when we first saw the treatment of people, of Yazidi people, particularly Yazidi women. Of course, but this is still continuing. And as my right honourable friend says, we must not forget, and we must do everything we can to ensure that these women are freed from what, as she says, in many cases is a life of slavery.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Children at Wester Hales Canal Primary View School in my constituency have just won the ultimate school trip competition with the prize of a holiday to Mallorca in next month. There's just one problem, Prime Minister. One of their classmates is a Syrian refugee, and he's been told by the Home Office that he can't travel with his friends as he doesn't have the proper documents. The Home Office say it will take 3 months for these documents to come through. Will the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary help me to cut through the red tape so this wee boy can go with his friends to enjoy the holiday of a lifetime?
Could I congratulate the primary school for winning this competition, which has that travel as the prize? And can I say to the Honourable Lady that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has heard what she has said and will look into this case.
Good. Zach Goldsmith.
The Prime Minister will know that the courts have today overturned a decision by the Parole Board to release black cab rapist John Warboys. Does she share my admiration for the brave victims who challenged this decision in court? Does she agree that they should never have had to do so? And does she agree that this gigantic decision, this landmark decision, must now provoke a rethink of a criminal justice system in which many of us no longer have confidence?
First of all, can I say to my honourable friend that I have the greatest sympathy, and I know the sympathies of the whole House will be with all those who were the victims of Warboys and what they have suffered as a result of his horrific crimes. And I welcome the judgment today that has found in favour of the brave victims who brought this legal action. The court's findings do give us give rise to serious concerns, and it is right that my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will be making a statement on this shortly.
Of course, one of the issues that they have raised is they have found that it is unlawful to have a blanket prohibition of disclosing parole board information. That is something my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, had already been looking into and has made clear that he will be ensuring that that is dealt with as soon as possible. For people's information, what will now happen is that the parole board, the decision will be reverting back to the parole board, but the evidence that the board has will be updated and it will take account of the findings of the court. But my honourable friend is right that this does give rise to serious concerns, and my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will be setting out the next steps to be taken in his statement later today.
Legendary succinctness, I trust. Jack Dramey.
Mr. Speaker, 259 years of GKN history will be decided in the next 24 hours. A hostile takeover not in the British national interest that the government has powers to block. Can I ask the Prime Minister this? Disturbing evidence has come to light of a hedge fund scam to buy shares in GKN whilst avoiding paying tax on shares that will determine the future of GKN. Will she agree to condemn this outrageous practice and to investigate as a matter of urgency?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, first on the issue of GKN, as he knows this is primarily a commercial decision for GKN. My right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, is in discussion with the parties on an impartial basis and has sought reassurance from them on their plans. And I say to the honourable gentleman, if he has evidence of illegal activity that has taken place, that should be reported to the proper authorities.
The Speaker's chaplain's first words this afternoon repeated Jesus' instruction to love others. I hope that the Prime Minister and leaders of opposition parties will help to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, Muslims from Islamophobia. In a particular case of a Sikh, Gopal Verdi, if the police, the CPS, the Home Office and others fail to have an independent inquiry into the recent prosecution of him, will the Prime Minister please meet me to discuss it?
First of all, to my honourable friend, I know this is a case that he has taken up and championed for some time. I believe it's the case that he and I have met and discussed previously, and obviously I'm willing to meet him to discuss that case again. On the more wider point that he makes, I think there should be a very clear message from all of us in this House that there is no place for racial hatred, for hate crime in our society. This should not be part of our society, whether it is Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. This is something we should all stand up against and do our best to eradicate from our society.
I'm sure we all agree that the Speaker's chaplain is an example of love, compassion and empathy from which we can all benefit. Liz Twist.
Mr. Speaker. Shortly, I will be meeting workers from De La Rue in my constituency who are visiting the House today. Will the Prime Minister give the House an assurance that no decision or announcement will be made on the passport contract until after recess, so that this House may discuss the issue?
Say to the honourable lady, this House, of course, did discuss the issue earlier this week when there was an urgent question to my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the Immigration Minister. On the matter that she raises, I understand that the final decision has not been taken, but a preferred bidder has been announced. There is then a proper process which gives a length of time for challenges to that to be brought forward, as I understand it, by others in the process, and the Home Office is following exactly the right process to ensure we have secure passports, that are produced at on a basis that gives good value to the taxpayer.
Philip Oliver.
Government Inspector's report into Northamptonshire County Council makes it crystal clear that there's no reason to further postpone the transfer of the fire service from the County Council to the Police and Crime Commissioner, given that this enjoys popular support and the support of the county's 7 MPs and is essential to protect investment in the fire service and protect firefighters' jobs. will the Prime Minister instruct the Police and Fire Minister to approve this transfer without delay?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I think he knows that I, as Home Secretary, was long a champion of fire services being able to come under the Police and Crime Commissioner's areas of responsibility, and indeed it was a former Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner in Northamptonshire who was one of the early proponents of that particular move. I've heard what he said, and I will make sure that the comments he's made today are brought to the attention of the Policing and Fire Minister.
Order.
Prime Minister's questions comes to an end. Jeremy Corbyn began his 6 questions on the subject of autism, a particular recent very sad case, and then broadened out to the general financing and quality of services for mental health. And Mr Corbyn said there were now 5,000 fewer mental health nurses. Prime Minister responded not to deny that, or we're not exactly sure whether that's true or not, but to say that mental health spending was now 11.6 billion within the NHS budget, and that was the highest it had been. And Mr Corbyn then moved on to mental health services for younger people and accused the government of not funding that, that they were particular problems of the young and they weren't getting enough attention. So it was an interesting exchange on a very important subject. Whether we learned anything, there was a lot of party politics in it. I think maybe some people will think mental health is one of these subjects where the parties should get together and agree a way forward, because it's so important. There was some criticism of Mr Corbyn for not raising the issue of the Justice Minister. They've just moved to an urgent question about this as a result of the War Boys case now being referred back to the parole board. Many people think Mr Gauke is holding on to his job and it wasn't raised actually by the Leader of the Opposition, despite the Minister being vulnerable. It wasn't raised by anybody until towards the end, when Mr Goldsmith, Conservative MP, he raised it, and they've now moved on to that. I think that'll be a moving story as the day goes on. The Prime Minister also announced, obviously pre-prepared, another 600 million for the Ministry of Defence to use in the building of a new generation of submarines called the Dreadnought subs, which is interesting because she seems to be in something of a spending mode these days with the NHS and study into tuition fees, more money for defence now. There could well be more where that comes from. Let's have a look at all this. I'm with the Energy Minister, Claire Perry, and the Shadow Education Minister, Tracy Brabin, and of course the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. So, Claire Perry, where's all this money coming from?
Well, it's coming from having a strong economy. That means if you continue to grow your tax base and you manage public spending, you can afford to invest.
But we know the figures for that. They were announced in the spring statement. So we know the projections based on the tax base for tax and spend. This is in addition to what was in the spring statement. So where's that coming from?
Well, it suggests that there is, as the Chancellor has talked about, there was some headroom in the spring statement. If the economy continues to perform, we can afford to invest.
So the Chancellor is assuming then that the OBR's growth forecasts are too pessimistic and that there will be more revenues coming, and he's already started to spend it.
Well, Andrew, you always invite me to tell the Chancellor how he should be spending his money, and I always decline the invitation.
No, I'm trying to find out where it comes from. Unless, of course, you found the magic money tree, which politicians every now and then seem to stumble across.
We haven't found that. We found a strong economy with debt falling. Which
but are you now assuming to finance this extra revenue that the economy is going to grow more strongly and therefore generate more revenues than the OBR's projections?
Well, I'm not. So to be clear, I'm not sure that the Dreadnought announcement is one that is new money. I suspect it's coming out of the existing envelope because we already have the commitment to defence. And I think it's quite right to continue to talk about the funding for the NHS. And if I may, I thought it was actually a really great start to PMQs. I can criticise Mr Corbyn for lots of things, but this issue of mental health parity and access for too long has been the sort of orphan of so much of the conversations around the NHS. And it's not, Tracy will say you need to spend more. I will say it's not just about the money. We're spending more and doing more than any government.
So why are there 5,000 fewer mental health nurses?
In fact, I guess the question is, if you look at it in terms of inputs, the outputs the Prime Minister was talking about is 1,400 more people a day are accessing mental health services. And in fact, Jeremy went on a waiting time statistic. Well, until Conservative government, we didn't have any waiting times for mental health services. They simply weren't tracked. So clearly there's more that needs to be done. We're also, mental health in the workplace. This is not something that the NHS just has to deal with. It's about support for people in the workplace. So it's a massively important issue. And I think you've got the sense there of the really strong commitment of the PM to actually understanding this and investing more in it.
It's been a theme of Labour for quite some time now that austerity has gone on for too long, and that in a number of areas the government's not been spending enough. And it's a theme that's resonated. But if the government is now turning on the spending taps, that theme runs out of road, does it not?
Well, it's spending where? It's where they're choosing to spend, isn't it? We've got very low growth. We've got wages stagnating. People using food banks. It's where you choose to put your money.
Well, they're choosing to put it in the NHS.
Well, certainly what they're doing is that I think that they're closing the black hole that they've left in mental health services, where they've, between 2010 and 2015, 600 million.
There was a real fall in spending.
A massive, and certainly you cut nurses' bursaries, then there's retention and, employment of mental health nurses, is
But if
going
they are
to
not
be a
going
crisis.
to spend more in NHS, where does Labour's narrative go?
Well, it's to hold the government to account, to make sure that that money is certainly, we've seen in the past, money, it's all very well to say we're going to spend more money, but then we need to see on the ground that it doesn't just go and plug the gap in the loss of funding to the NHS more widely.
There is something happening, isn't there now,
Oh, yeah.
in the party dynamic between the two. The government has decided that it is going to spend more in a number of areas, and I do think that the Chancellor is assuming that the growth will be higher. And he's already spending that money that will come as a result of higher growth than the OBR predicted. He senses that they've had enough of austerity, and I would suggest, Laura, also that Mrs May now wants to talk about more than Brexit. She wants to have an agenda other than Brexit.
Well, in a year, this week, we will be out of the European Union. Now, of course, lots of our viewers might think, well, transition goes on for ages, all of the rest. But in both parties, there are politicians now talking about that post-Brexit landscape, to use a terrible jargon phrase. But the moments after, the next spending review, the run-up to the next general election, who will be setting the agenda then? And you're absolutely right, around the top table in government, and it's been coming really since the general election, there has been both an admission inside the Tory party that for many voters, actually austerity had just gone too far, who's seeing them as a kind of party that was cutting for cutting's sake, and that people were really feeling the pinch in various different areas. They know that. But also there is, it's my sense, a kind of tone of moving on to this next phase.
Right.
And
yes,
for
it's
all
a
new phase where, look, Philip Hound isn't going to be running around writing cheques for everything.
Oh, no.
There's no question on that. There is still going to be a pretty tight framework across the public sector in terms of spending. But in certain key areas, the attitude will be
He's finding some money that wasn't there
flexible.
before.
But it's a very live debate in
And
government. We're still fighting about it.
We shall try and track down where this money's coming from. Now, yesterday, the Foreign Secretary was ticked off by the Speaker, John Bercow. Let's have a look at this.
Isn't that extraordinary? This is an institution. Say no, says the noble and learned lady, the Baroness, whatever it is, I can't remember what it is. Newgee.
I don't want to be unkind or discourteous to the Foreign Secretary, but I say on advice as the clerks swivel round to me, two things. First of all, we don't name call in this chamber. And secondly, I'm dealing with the matter. The right honourable gentleman will listen and benefit from listening. Secondly, we do not address people by the titles of their spouses. The Shadow Foreign Secretary has a name, and it's not Lady something. We know what her name is, and it is inappropriate and frankly sexist to speak in those terms. And I'm not having it in this chamber. That is the end of the matter. No matter how senior a member, that parlance is not legitimate, it will not be allowed, and it will be called out on it, and I require no chuntering from a secretary position from any occupant of the Treasury bench. I've said what the position is, and believe me, that is the end of the matter.
Well, I guess Mr. Bercow and Mr. Johnson are best friends.
Well, what you didn't clip was Boris making immediately a fulsome and full apology for that. And I think, look, I actually think John Bercow was completely right in that case. The tradition is, if you don't want to be known by your spouse's name, that is the name you're known by. And Emily Thornberry's always made it quite clear that that's her working name.
It's been done before, though, by Tories, hasn't it? Even Mr Cameron had a go.
Believe me, Andrew,
lines.
I've sat on the benches being called lots of names, most of them unprintable. There is a culture of robust exchanges in the House of Commons, which is not a good thing.
Mr Johnson,
but he apologised immediately and profusely.
It was interesting, though, as Mr Bercow was dressing down the Foreign Secretary in quite robust terms. But he did allow applause in the House of Commons.
I know, I was actually in the chamber.
And because it was for him, he didn't object.
Yes, I was actually applauding. I mean, it's like Tatler when they say, Mrs. John Smith. I mean, it's
Did
just...
you read Tatler?
Well, it's out of date, it's patronising, it's diminishing, and it's
Let me give you a guess
unnecessary.
the year. Because it was 1965. Claire Perry, press that buzzer.
Come on, let's press it together if it's your first time. 1, 2, 3, go.
Quick.
63.
No wonder problem.
So sexist.
Takes two. Keith Lytle from Essex.
65.
That's it. Daily Politics will be back tomorrow. I'll be back on BBC One tomorrow, Thursday night. Bye-bye.